Hello and good afternoon and welcome to another Twitter Space panel. This one focusing on the securitization of climate change. And joining us on the panel today is Josh Busby, who is a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center and a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, as well as a senior research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Also joining us on the panel today is Guilio Boccaletti, who's a research associate at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment. Also joining us today is Sharon Burke, who is a member of the Climate Security Expert Network, and she served in many senior positions throughout the US government, including Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. Also joining the panel today is Scott Stephenson, who is an environmental and political geographer with the RAND Corporation, specializing in climate security and policy. His research also utilizes geospatial modeling to investigate human-linked climate change and natural systems. So I'm going to throw this first question to Josh. If we were to pitch climate change to the general public as a security issue and put it down the road of securitization rather than as a climate or cultural issue at the moment, do you think that would change how the public perceives it and how the public should be addressing this issue in particular?
Thanks for having me. I think when you ask about the public, I'm not sure there's widespread perception of climate as a security risk per se, not quite in those terms. I think as you have increased appreciation by people in their everyday lives of the risk of climate change in terms of extreme weather events, drought, floods, that those in and of themselves are security threats, but the lived experience for people is not to necessarily appreciate them as security threats per se, but just as uh, terrible effects on their lives. And as a consequence of that lived experience, I believe that people in the United States and other places have increased appreciation for the severity and gravity of the problem. Now, the security language in policy circles serves a different purpose to elevate the appreciation of the importance of the issue and to take the security consequences in and of themselves seriously. And so I think for elite circles, that has captivated policymakers for more than a decade, at least in the United States, on somewhat of a bipartisan basis, where even if people dispute the science of climate change in some circles, that is people have been attuned to needing to prepare for the increased impact of extreme weather events, and they may use euphemisms to talk about the problem, but that has facilitated, for example, U.S. military thinking about and preparing for this problem for more than a decade already.
Sharon, this is one of the issues that's actually been on your plate to solve. How would securitization and people viewing this as a security issue change the public perception around the combating of climate change?
Hey, it's good to be with you. So what does it mean? Well, I think the concept of securitization, was a theory developed in the international relations community, and it's a really interesting concept. That governments have a tendency to label something as security in order to raise its importance and make it more eligible for special kinds of funding and activity. I don't think that's untrue, and we've seen that in the United States and everything from like the war on drugs. There's always something that's taking on the language and the trappings of war and of security in order to communicate that it's really important, that it's about survival, that it's existential. But whether or not that language actually puts you in the right place is a different thing. And I'm going to say two things that are basically contradictory on this. So just to give my fellow panelists some food for throwing. One is that on the one hand, that's problematic, especially when it comes to climate change, because if we're going to actually succeed in climate action, it needs to be about cooperation and collaboration, whether you're talking about the innovation we need to have or societal changes. It requires individuals, communities, states to work together. And so the language of adversaries and fighting and combating, that frame of reference kind of puts us in the wrong place when you're talking about writ large what needs to happen. On the other hand, as an American, I could say that I think we tend to define security a little too narrowly as being just about force of arms and war. That is sort of the ultimate human experience, war, and it's, part of our existence, always has been and always will be. So it's a very it's the ultimate human expression. However, going to what Josh said, what is security to a person going about their daily life? It's being able to go about your daily life, having food, having kids who get education, having a home that's safe, whether it's from the elements or from crime. So what security really, really means at the end of the day is that ability to live a safe daily life. And in that sense, climate change is absolutely a security challenge. And so I think it's both things. I think that when we put it just in the language of war and the military, there's a role for that, but it's not the right frame of reference for this particular challenge. Not yet, unless we get to, unfettered climate change, then we can have a different conversation. But at the same time, we need to think about security differently.
So, Scott, you've just joined us as well, and thanks for jumping in. How would you change the messaging around this? Do you think we should be putting this as a security issue, and do you think that will actually get some of the people who are maybe still climate skeptical over the line to take this issue as seriously as they should?
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for inviting me to participate. To some extent, I think the securitization of climate change is inevitable. I think, the more that headlines are focusing on issues globally that have traditionally existed within traditional security spaces that are exacerbated, made worse by climate change, the more these issues will be intertwined. I'm not sure I have a perfect prescription for how I would change the messaging per se, but I do think that in a general sense, that the more climate change becomes intertwined with the everyday concerns of organizations like the military, which traditionally haven't been at the forefront of raising the urgency of the issue, the more the public will see climate change as a threat alongside, again, more traditional security concerns. And therefore, the more normalized the idea of climate change as being something that is an existential issue for us all, with a whole of government approach, as our current government intends to do, to tackle, the more that idea will become normalized. And so I'm not sure that it's necessarily an explicit messaging suggestion that I would make, but just a point that the more that climate change becomes just a fact, just a reality on the ground that every government agency is going to have to grapple with in some way, the more the public is going to see that, and the more I think the more normalized those conversations will become, and perhaps less political polarization might result.
Julia, what are the pros and cons of approaching this as a security issue, and particularly when it comes to political rhetoric, going into coal country and putting this as look, this is about energy security, this is about energy independence, this is about making us ready for whatever happens. What are the pros and cons about approaching it on that particular angle?
Well, first of all, Michael, it's great to be with you and with all the other panelists. Let me maybe preface my answer by saying that, interestingly, climate issues were originally principally a security issue, in the sense that when what we call today climate science was first developed, it was the brainchild of John von Neumann and a few other people who came from the Air Force and from the Navy, who were trying to model the commons that the United States was trying to project its power over. And so we have climate models in part because there was a time when some folks thought you could weaponize climate, and others thought that at a minimum you might want to understand the operating conditions over the seas and the skies of the world, right? So for a long time, this idea that the climate, the science of climate, and the infrastructure that goes with it was part of the security apparatus of a country, in particular of the United States, was not a mystery. I mean, there are New York Times articles from the late 1940s, early 50s, where this was discussed openly. And so I think that one of the things we should remember is that the discussion about security and climate is not new. It happened. It's just that then, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, this has become increasingly an environmental issue rather than an operating conditions issue. And so now we're going back to this question of what happens and what are the power consequences of changing operating conditions on the planet. That's not a new question, but it's a new question for us. And so I suppose one of the pros is that we reconnect with that tradition. I also think one of the things that happened at the time, which I think might be another pro of the securitization of the question, is that the military had a tradition of long-term research that other non-military and civilian agencies, have lost over the years. Having great science on the oceans or the atmospheres requires very long-term investments. And over the years, if you talk to many climate scientists, you come to realize that actually we become more and more short-term. Then maybe the last thing I'll say is that I do agree very much with what Sharon was saying earlier, that there's a broader definition of security here. It's not just a narrow sort of competitive advantage on the narrow sort of military field, but it's the ability to deliver security to citizens, right? And that has to do with control of conditions within the sovereign territory, but also increasingly control, for example, over the value chains that spread the world. And that in part has to do with our ability to monitor, forecast, and understand, the things that planes and ships go through. So, I'm not sure I'm answering your question of pros and cons, but I do think that we have a precedent for the language of securitization. And I think what that told us was that climate science and then climate change within it has a role in the long-term thinking of strategy.
Josh, hey, Michael.
Yeah, jump on in, Sharon.
Giulio, that was such a fascinating. At first, I was like puzzled about what you were talking about, and I realized you're talking about the experiments with weather modification, and which, by the way, there is now, partly because of those experiments, there's an international treaty that prohibits military or other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. So I just would say it's a really, really interesting example, but I would say it's very different from what we're talking about now, in that, yes, the United States and others were looking at weather modification as a battlefield tool. But in this case, climate change is something that's an outgrowth of the entire industrial revolution that's affecting planetary systems. And so it's a condition you have to deal with, not a tool that you're manipulating. I think it's a very different situation.
Well, if I could just add, I mean, yes, I was referring to that, but actually, the fact is that the whole modeling tradition comes out of that. So it wasn't just about modification. We have the satellites we have the modeling infrastructure that we have, largely because there was this question of what the operating conditions might be. I suppose there are two aspects of that are quite interesting, and this is one man's opinion, but it's an interesting one. There are increasing conversations about geoengineering out there, and I suspect now it's on the fringes, but I suspect soon we'll be having these conversations about whether those treaties apply to broader questions of geoengineering, solar reflectance and the like. So that's one interesting chapter. I don't know that we've written the story yet on that one. And then the second one is that it's more than trying to modify the climate, even in a climate that's obviously transformed by the Industrial Revolution. What infrastructure you have to monitor it, to understand conditions on the ground, to just exercise power and sovereignty over the landscape and over the seas and atmosphere is a matter of competition. It's not a coincidence that the satellite infrastructure, for example, that's going up in space now from China has increased dramatically, right? I think, you look at the last conflict, the second thing that was done was shut Russia out of all meteorological information coming from Europe when the war in Ukraine started. So I think the securitization of climate, of the knowledge of the planet and what we do as it changes is more than just the mechanics of trying to modify it. It's about who knows more about how you operate in this changing environment.
So, Josh, obviously there are a lot of countries who are looking to their militaries or the Department of Defenses to effectively, combat this, build resilience, and get ready for the next decade of climate change going forward. How does the American response and the American DoD's work on this subject compare to, let's say, the Chinese Defense Department or some of the British or the Europeans? Are the Americans taking, the American military takes this more seriously than other countries? They take it less seriously? Can you take us through the international response?
I think that's somewhat of a difficult question to answer, in that I'm not sure if there is quite the awareness. For example, the Chinese military may be fairly opaque when it comes to how seriously they're taking it. I think in terms of other liberal democracies, it's easier to have a sense of how seriously they're taking the issue. For example, the UK or the Germans or the Australians. And in that respect, I think that the U.S. Department of Defense is probably out in front and has been for some time in thinking about what are the consequences of the impacts of climate change on the U.S. military. That has been something that, and Sharon knows this far better than me from her time in government, that this is not a new issue for the Department of Defense. This is something that goes back decades in thinking through the impacts. Now, I think that's had some continuity between administrations, but it's really accelerated in this administration, as evidenced by the recently released National Defense Strategy, which has ample climate mentions throughout. And that's just a sort of representative of the high level attention that it's getting now, but you have had investments in shoring up infrastructure and installations for many years. And I think that is indicative of the advanced preparations that the U.S. Department of Defense has made in this space relative to other, at least advanced industrialized democracies.
So, Scott, what are the issues you think the Department of Defense, particularly when it comes to the United States, will be taking seriously, first off the bat? What is top of the priority list for the DoD at the moment?
Well, I think, as Dr. Busby was alluding to, I think there have been some concerns that have been top of mind for a while. I think will continue to be in the, as he said, the National Defense Strategy and in a number of the constituent climate strategies that the respective services have come out with in recent months. There's been a very clear emphasis on ensuring resilience to climate hazards at installations. So shoring up infrastructure, ensuring that missions can continue to execute even in the face of uncertain and potentially very severe climate effects. That will continue to be, I think, top of mind for all of the services. Again, it's been going on for a while, but I think there is increasingly renewed focus on doing that and doing it well. I think the U.S. DoD is going to be increasingly focused on trying to understand not just how do we build resilience, how do we cope with a sudden climate shock, but how do we ensure in a general sense that force readiness is maintained in the face of a number of different climate threats, and how can missions continue to execute when, say, there may be increasingly severe demands on the DoD to, for example, utilize the military to respond to humanitarian disasters, defense support of civil authorities, as several have already mentioned, likely to increase in the future, and that's going to create additional demands on the force, as well as the direct effect of climate change causing damage to installations. So I think the military is increasingly interested building a general framework for ensuring that missions can continue to execute in spite of the possibility that there may be additional demands placed on them. And then finally, I'll say, as I mentioned, in these respective climate strategies that the services have come out with recently, you're seeing more of an emphasis on the U.S. military putting emissions reduction closer to the top of their priority list. In the Army's strategy, for example, you're seeing an interest in building microgrids and ensuring that bases can operate not only independently but using energy sources that are increasingly less reliant on the carbon economy. So I would say that's relatively less developed line of effort per se than some of these other things, but I think it's likely to grow in the future.
Julia, obviously this is an issue that you've dealt with quite a lot, and that's water. Right now we are seeing shrinking of the Mississippi River. Utah in particular is having real issues getting water out there. If water crises continue to worsen in the country, is it more likely that people will turn toward the DoD to solve this problem, or will private companies be able to solve this problem? Who's up to actually solve the crisis of water in Utah or Mississippi?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, historically, the plumber in chief in the United States specifically is the Army Corps of Engineers. And so there's an enormous amount of experience particularly in dealing with intrastate kind of issues. In the US, it's there's an enormous amount of jurisprudence. This is not going to be just an engineering question. It's a kind of political and legal question ultimately of how you deal with less water. And mostly the United States is going to be able to adjust. The question is, how does the economy transition? Particularly, how does the farming and agricultural economy transition? So I don't know that there's going to be beyond the technical role. I don't know that there's going to be an enormous amount of sort of military involvement. Lower Mississippi is managed by the Army Corps of Engineers, but again, that will be in their sort of operational role. I do think that then there's this story about increasing water security issues around the world, potentially exacerbating conflicts. Again, the empirical evidence actually suggests that that's not really true, that in transboundary water issues tend to lead to forced diplomacy far more frequently than they lead to conflict. But of course, where state capacity is limited or not available at all, where there are extremely fragile states, then issues around water security can lead to localized conflict that can escalate quite quickly. In that case, then you end up in a militarized situation, and it's possible that in the future that will draw in also international forces, NATO forces, and maybe even American forces. So that's the military has an enormous history of managing water issues for over a century, and it'll probably continue to play some role in that. But I don't know that that's water is fundamentally a kind of in the scope of the political systems rather than sort of military and security systems.
So Josh, obviously, one of the subjects you've worked on quite a lot is trying to actually convince people climate change is real, get on board with it. This is what we need to do with our economy. If we're not using security and we're not using effectively, just hitting people over the head with the facts, what have you seen as the most successful way to get some of the climate skeptic people to actually take this issue as seriously as we probably should?
I think this comes back to the question of whether or not this is a framing issue or a political issue. And I'm not sure that how we frame the problem necessarily is ever going to be all that successful with climate skeptics. It's actually more about, if you look at some of the surveys from the Yale project that has done exhaustive surveys of the American public, you have a large majority of Americans who are already preoccupied by this problem, but it politically you have ideological conviction by folks in one political party who have really for years denied the existence of this problem and inculcated that and elevated this denial into sort of a partisan signifier. And that on some level is difficult to shake free of. And so I'm not sure that there is a security frame or any other messaging that will change that dynamic in the absence of people in their lived experience as individuals in their daily lives are feeling the effects of extreme weather events, and at some point a large enough proportion of them will just say, I don't care what my political leaders say, this is a real problem, and I'm going to vote for people who are attuned to my experience and my needs. And I think we're already seeing that. But the holdover ideological conviction of folks who have denied the existence of this problem is really deterred the U.S. ability to kind of turn its politics around and address this problem. We had the narrowest of Senate majorities to be able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's a testament to how polarized the elite conversation on this. But at the mass level, most people recognize that this particular problem is something that's real and we need to do something about it. And I don't think trying to change the framing to appeal to skeptics is going to be all that successful. We just need to translate that majority opinion into different outcomes, so that there is more of political space to act as we need to.
So Sharon, one of the things we discussed when we had you on the program recently was the National Guard being used to fight fires, and we're finding increasingly the National Guard being used to fight fires in California and the southern states, as well as fix infrastructure during flooding. And this is becoming year-round. And if our National Guard or our Army Reserves are being deployed domestically, we obviously now don't have a reserve if we end up at war. How serious do you think an issue do you think this is, and how bad do you think it's going to get? And is there a solution to the problem? Do we need to recruit more people into the National Guard and just start a firefighting corps, or is this not that bad an issue and we can not worry about it?
I think it's definitely a concern. For the National Guard and the reserves, those are forces that are meant to be exactly what reserve sounds like, which is they're your reserve for in case the country is threatened with a war or with a battle, that these are the people who you're going to call up to defend you. So that's their primary purpose. Now, dealing with natural disasters, especially for the National Guard, is within their mission set. It's within the mission set for all military forces, by the way, to respond to humanitarian and disaster missions. That is one of the missions or the capabilities that's within scope for them. The issue here is that it's not necessarily something we actively plan for in military forces, in the sense that all military forces worldwide are going to be looking ahead at what's the threat they need to prepare for, what's the future they think they anticipate, what kind of force do they need in order to be able to meet that future. And usually disasters are not part of that active planning effort. They're considered something that you can meet, a challenge you can meet from within the envelope of what you have. So if we're talking about a future where there are going to be far more disasters, and certainly there's plenty of evidence that that's the case. If you look at, for example, NOAA's tracking of billion-dollar disasters in the United States, they've been escalating dramatically, partly because people are locating on coasts and other places that are more vulnerable, but also it's because the severity of these disasters is increasing. So if we're not actively planning for a world where there's going to be much more call on these forces for those kinds of missions, then we won't be ready for it. And it could definitely compromise the primary purpose that those forces are for. And by the way, I did have was part of a meeting with a group of leaders of African militaries, and they are having the same problem with their active forces, who are having to respond to disasters so frequently that it means that they're not keeping up their readiness for other kinds of missions. So what do we do about that? As you say, one possibility is that you make a bigger National Guard and that you look at their equipment and make sure that you're equipped correctly, both for those kinds of disaster missions and also so that you're still going to be ready for other missions. I don't think that that's very tenable. I think it would be very difficult for the Guard. The Guard already has trouble fighting for resources, so I don't see that as a really strong possibility. I think one really interesting answer, and it's within their legal authorities already, is that the Guard could get more involved in resilience building, or what in the military world you call left of boom. So right now they're largely a response force, where if there's a disaster and the governor requests it, they go. But you could also get them more involved in making communities less vulnerable to disasters, so that they're less likely to need the same level of response. So I think that's one really important possibility worldwide, actually, is to be investing more in preparedness and resilience.
So Scott, we're going to start into a bit of a wraparound on this particularly poignant question. But if I was to make you the president of the United States, congratulations, it's a good promotion. I think you'll do well. What would be the big policies you would go for? How would you change current US trajectory? And do you think that the current Biden administration actually could get it done if they really, really wanted to go down that road?
Thanks. That's a fascinating question. I was really struck, you mentioned earlier political polarization and convincing skeptics, kind of in that same ballpark. I was really struck by the success of the CHIPS Act earlier this year, bipartisan act that aimed to shore up the U.S. semiconductor industry for a number of reasons, but from a security perspective, not least in order to counter the Chinese dominance in this particular sector. I'd love to see something like that put out, but more specifically focused on green technology. For some time now, China has been outpacing us in the green tech sector, at least as far as their manufacturing capacity is concerned. I think we certainly have the ability to catch up, but it's going to take considered effort on the part of the United States. And I think this is an area where there is room for bipartisan agreement, to the extent that securitizing, quote unquote, the issue as something where competition with China could be integrated as a motivator, to the extent that could help push over the line. I think it can and should be done. So I'd like to see that. And then if I could maybe get a little bit more bold from a more kind of foreign trade policy perspective, I'd like to see the U.S. pursue something along the lines of what the economist William Nordhaus has suggested, which is a sort of climate club where like-minded countries which have similar climate goals and have made similarly ambitious commitments to upholding them can pursue favorable trade deals with each other. This, of course, would send some ripple effects, to say the least, throughout the economy, and so it's something that should be done with care. But I think internationally, at least if we're talking about what the Biden administration itself maybe has the ability to do, that the executive branch does dictate foreign policy. So it's something that I would be interested in seeing a bit more of an aggressive push toward, to make sure that we are rewarding those trade partners of ours who are doing well with their climate commitments, and maybe encouraging a step up of ambition from those trade partners, perhaps who haven't. As for whether they can get it done, my crystal ball is blank at the moment, but it seems to me that a lot of this is going to depend on midterms coming up very soon. The U.S. ability to affect key legislative action within at least the current term may have expired, and it may be on executive action from here on out. But we will see.
Guilio, it's been a very short presidency for Scott. He's no longer the president. I'm going to make you the president now. Still just short of Liz Truss. Guilio, what would you do if you were the president of the United States?
I'm trying to. There we go. Can you hear me? Given that I'm a foreign-born nationalist, even more remarkable than I'm a president. I suppose I do two things at the top of my list. On the domestic front, one of the reasons that we keep conceiving of the issues in terms of emergency response is that the institutions and infrastructure that we have in place that have controlled our environment for the better part of a century were dimensioned on a different climate than the one that we're heading into. So the solution to that is not, in fact, increasing the amount of emergency response that we have, but we have to change the institutions and infrastructure to dimension them to the new conditions. And that's not impossible, but it requires a coherent plan of adaptation at the national and state level. And that's, the same problem in the US that there is in Europe. We don't yet have that coherence, in part because historically focus on adaptation was seen as a moral hazard. People thought that by adapting, we wouldn't put in enough attention to mitigating carbon emissions. And so adaptation was always on the back burner. Well, it seems now clear that we have to have a coherent national and international approach to adaptation. So that's number one. That will free up a lot of the resources that are now buried in sort of emergency response. The second thing I would do is that there is, I think, once again, a competition for primacy in the knowledge and monitoring of the planet. There are parts of this planet, from the Arctic, which we haven't talked about much, but is changing very rapidly and changing commerce quite rapidly, to spaceborne infrastructure that allows you to know what's going on to the planet, to autonomous vehicles underwater that help you understand and map where resources are. That's a competitive landscape that 50 years ago, the United States would have been well ahead of everybody else and now isn't. And I think that's where, competition in the commons provoked by the transition of the economy is going to happen. And so that'd be the second focus I would put on, is rebuilding the capacity of the country in earth science and technology.
Josh, the presidency of Guilio is over. You're now the president. What would you do?
Well, I think my predecessors have done a terrific job in identifying some of the major challenges. Enhancing the U.S. competitive position, in part, is about investing in resilience at home and abroad. So creating that political space to make those necessary investments in adaptation that Giulio alluded to a moment ago is really important. One of the things that I think we have to recognize is that if this becomes to be seen as the military problem, then a lot of other things have failed, and that we haven't made the necessary investments either domestically or internationally to prepare for these sets of issues. And it's a kind of classic refrain. You've heard it from former Secretary of the Defense Gates, that we have underinvested in civilian instruments in the foreign policy space. That's diplomacy and development, and those are really the first lines of intervention to ensure that this suite of problems internationally don't elevate and escalate to become problems that then are ones for the Department of Defense. So it's a difficult question to create the space for that. But the president, President Biden, has gone out and requested $3 billion a year for adaptation by 2024 as part of his emergency plan for adaptation and resilience. And it's not clear that there is congressional appetite for that. And unless the midterm elections that are upcoming change that dynamic, most of what the federal agencies will have to do to try to meet that commitment is to scour the landscape of programs that they already have to see how many are plausibly in the adaptation space. But that's not any way to run a railroad, let alone a superpower like the United States. And the Chinese government, through its Belt and Road Initiative and other efforts, is making ample efforts to invest in infrastructure and other needs of would-be allies around the world. And if we're not present at the table with an offer set that countries that are facing climate impacts find compelling, then they'll turn inevitably to other actors at will, and that may have attendant negative consequences for them in terms of debt traps and other issues. Now, in some cases, the Chinese offer set for foreign assistance or investment may be address some of their needs. In other cases, perhaps less so. But we're absent in many cases from that conversation and don't seem to have
uh, the will to even figure out what we want to do in that space. And so we have both immense challenges domestically in addressing our adaptation needs, which have been classically underfunded, but we also are not engaging in it at the level of seriousness that we need to address the climate needs of our friends and allies around the world. So as president, I would make it a priority to do that, but there's only so much that a president can do, and that really requires more political space in Congress to be able to appropriate resources for those purposes.
And to wrap us up and bring us to the end of this panel, Sharon, you've had three pretty good administrations before you. What would you do differently? And as president, how would you tackle this particular issue?
Yes, they were all great, and they've left me with some really excellent options, including that, Scott passed a green technology law, which looks, by the way, a lot like the laws that have already been passed, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and also American Cares. Two of those were were not strongly, but were bipartisan. So in fact, we've already got that commitment. So that's great. I think I would change this. What I would be talking about now is that this is something we have to do in every community in this country. We need to make sure that every community is disaster resilient, is better able to take what's happening, and also better prepared for a changing future. So this is something that's about making every American ready for the future and taking that investment home to Americans. So that is, as Giulio said, I think there's been a reluctance to talk about adaptation that way, that you are somehow giving up everything else that needs to happen. And I say we have to completely adopt that language and say that the innovation, the resilience, everything that needs to happen for you where you are. So our strategy would be a national strategy to build that in our country. I think also that part of that strategy of that resilience that we have to build is not just talking about, oh, it's climate change, but talking about a series of things that we're going to do together, that we're going to improve our water security and our food security. And these are things that are bipartisan, that tend to attract strong support, whether it's better agricultural policy or better water policy. And again, we're going to bring this home to everybody. This is not just something that's abstract at a national level. It's where you live. We're going to look at all these things together and how they work together and make this a plan. And also, we're going to look at our social fabric and the political life of this country, of the United States. Because if we do not preserve our democratic republic, which is at great risk right now, immense risk, then all of this is for naught. This country is a real engine of innovation. We are going to be part of the answer. And I don't doubt for a second that China will be the next adopter. But it has to come from here. And the secret for us is having a free society and a democratic republic. And so if we do not preserve the political nature of this country, then nothing else will follow. So I would prioritize that as well. And so both of those things, to make sure that this is something that people feel. I completely agree with President Josh, with President Busby, that allies and partners, we cannot achieve this alone, and even our adversaries. We will work with everyone we need to work with to make sure that American life and this shared global commons are going to be habitable for humans out into the future. So that's my plan.
That sounds like a good plan to me. So thank you to everyone who tuned in to this live Twitter space. Obviously, it'll be on Twitter for the next week for people who tune in later points, and it'll also be available on our YouTube in the next few days. So I want to give a huge thanks to Josh Busby, Giulio Boccaletti, Sharon Burke, and Scott Stephenson. All of you were absolutely fantastic to have on this one, tackling a pretty big issue, and particularly right before COP. So thanks so much for giving us your time, and we'll hopefully have you back sometime in the future.